Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction. Now, it's only been a couple of weeks since the election and a week since we said goodbye to Jess, but it all feels like months ago. Politics under Labour is coming at me fast and hard, I can tell you that. Ruth, so much has happened, hasn't it?
It's, I have to say, if you wanted how to establish yourself on the world stage kind of fortnight, always say better be lucky than good.
He's very lucky, isn't he?
He's a very lucky man, yeah.
Many people would say he's very good as well, wouldn't they, though?
That's not my job.
That's not your job, but I have got someone here that might be their job sometimes. So look, we've said goodbye to Jess, but this podcast is absolutely not stopping. And today we say hello to our first very special guest. Hello, Emily Thornberry.
Hello.
Now, we're going to do a proper introduction to Emily in a minute. But first, I want to tell you what we'll be talking about this week. We will cover the state opening of Parliament and the King's speech, my visit to Blenheim Palace with no fewer than 45 European leaders. Keir Starmer has met everyone in 2 weeks. It would normally take, as one official said to me yesterday, 5 years to get through that lot. And we'll talk more about the safety of politicians after the assassination attempt on President Trump. So we've got absolutely loads to get on with. Now, Emily, hello.
Hello.
It's wonderful to have you on our podcast. Now, you have been the MP, I got to get this right, Islington South and Finsbury for 19 years. Your last big job in the Labour Party was Shadow Attorney General. You've had loads of jobs in the Shadow Cabinet, including Shadow Foreign Secretary, Shadow Defence and Shadow International Trade. You're a heavy hitter. It's nice to have you on our pod. How have the last couple of weeks been for you?
It's been brilliant in that I've put a huge amount of work into making sure that we get elected. And it was fantastic going up and down the country. And on election day, I'm like driving up from Dover, because I've been helping out in Dover in that marginal seat. And I've got to go home to vote and to do a bit of campaigning in my own seat. And I've got someone with me and I'm going, let's send good luck messages to everybody that we visited in the last year. And we made a list and we'd been to 48 different constituencies in a year. So we're sending good luck messages to all of them and they all got elected.
So they all came back. So now you've got your own, you've got your own posse.
Well,
you've got an Emily Thornberry clique.
No, it's all team. It's all team. To see us get that kind of result and to be in Parliament where we have more new MPs than we have people returning. I mean, that's just extraordinary.
And you are not in the cabinet. You were the Shadow Attorney General. What happened?
I wasn't given a job. I mean, I'm very sad about that. I'm really disappointed because I was looking forward, to actually getting on and doing things. My political heroes are all people whose legacies come from doing stuff, not just making great speeches. So I wanted to have the chance to serve and to be in a Labour government, but it's not happened. It was a surprise. I was expecting it, but, it didn't happen. And it's a bit like grief, I think. I feel really, really sad and really disappointed not to be part of, of this great project. But I will do everything I can to support it and to make sure that we succeed, because that's what's most important, is that we have a government that can turn the country around. So it's been a hard time, if I'm honest, and you just have to kind of deal with the disappointment, really, and look forward to what you can do next.
But it wasn't that Starmer picked another politician to take the Attorney General job. He brought someone in from outside of government, didn't he? He brought in a guy called Richard Hermer, who is a KC.
Oh, and he's a really swanky lawyer. Yeah. I mean, I am not a swanky lawyer.
I think you're quite swanky.
I'm quite swanky, but I'm swanky in lots of ways. Once you become a lawyer, you're always a lawyer, right? So I did 20 years as a barrister, but I did criminal law. I did talking to juries. I did, what motivates people. It's all about, that's what it's all about. It's not really about an academic deep understanding of the law. So if I was to be Attorney General, I would rely heavily on advice.
Yeah.
I'd put a bit of politics into it, but I would rely heavily on advice. And, Keir has made a completely understandable decision that he wants to have a swanky lawyer. That's fine. As I say, I've been it twice. Yeah. I said both to Ed and to Keir, I'm not a swanky lawyer, but I'll do the best I can. So that's fine. It's just like not getting anything else. And I would have done anything else, but I wasn't offered anything. And I spend quite a lot of time when I'm with constituents saying, look, what you've been through is terrible, but you need to look to the future. There's no point eating yourself up.
I agree.
You've got to look at what you're going to do next. So, I'm going to stand for the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And I think if I was, elected by the whole House to do that, that would be a fantastic job to do.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you next.
All right.
The absolute thing you absolutely have to do, surely, given all the experience you've had, is be a chair of a select committee.
I hope I've got kind of quite a lot of experience, the relevant stuff. And I've never been a chair of a select committee, and I haven't been on a select committee, obviously, for a long time because I've been on the front bench for more than a decade. But, it'll be something new, and it will be... there's a lot of wild going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of wild going on, Ruth.
Can you explain, even to me, who served in Holyrood for 10 years, who's now in the Lords, what the division is for committee chairs in the Commons? Because some of them have to be chaired by an opposition member, and some of them can be chaired by a member that's from the party of government, but you're supposed to put your party colours to one side. So explain to me how the split goes, and explain to the listeners why that is.
For those of you listening, if you don't know what a select committee is, in Parliament there are committees formed of backbenchers from all political parties, and they basically have different briefs, so they mirror or shadow government departments, and then they hold that department to account. So they do reports, they interview ministers, they interview civil servants in their briefs. So say Emily did foreign affairs, she would mirror the Foreign Office. She'd have David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, would come and appear. She would pick areas to do reports into foreign affairs, and it's a really powerful backbench check on the government. And for journalists, they're really important because they deliver us news lines, they point us to bits of policy that aren't working. So select committees, we love select committees, so that's what they are.
They can be properly dramatic. If you think of any time, particularly I think of Boris Johnson sitting there with his ruffled hair and piles of binders and just spaffing stuff that it was clear that he'd not researched. And there's like this almost horseshoe shape of MPs with like a proper face on them just going at him. If you are the department chief, so if you are the Foreign Secretary or the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, like you don't get to duck out of it. You have to go.
You have to go.
You have to go, and you have to answer, and you have to know your shit.
And the power that you get as chair of a select committee, you've been elected by the whole House, so they want you. So that's your mandate. Yeah. And you have to then work cross-party. So, and if you have a good relationship with other members of the select committee, you can then all decide this is what you want to do and this is how you're going to do it.
Now, also, just can I ask you, how do you get elected to be a select committee chair?
So it's a vote of the whole House. And you have to go around and talk to, or as many as you can, 650 people, and try and persuade them to vote for you.
You must have 48 votes in the bag because you went and did their campaigning in their seats. So that's 48 down, no? Emily Thornberry, you're going all the way.
I hear you, but I want to get people from across the House to vote for me. So I've been to see various senior Tories as well, and I've spoken to various senior Labour people.
It's a serious operation.
It's a serious operation.
It's a serious schmooze, persuasion operation. This is exactly what politicians are made for. This is what you live for, isn't it?
I do enjoy it.
I bloody love a select committee. As journalists, you get to go and sit it. When I was in print, I do it less now on TV. You get to go and sit and then you can take notes and
Well, so does the public.
I love it. Yeah, you can
so
go in.
So the public. The point is, people don't realise that palace is the people's palace, and they can go in and they can watch what MPs are doing, and they have an absolute right to do it.
So say you did want to go and watch the Chancellor one day, or you could literally turn up at you could go as a visitor, turn up at a select committee and sit there and watch Rachel Reeves give evidence, if that is your heart's desire.
Can I ask a thing? Because of where I'm from, our committee system in Holyrood was such that basically the parties decided who were on it. I know there's supposed to be independence, but it never really worked like that. Centralised parties decided who sat on what committees. If Keir, for whatever reason, wanted to block you, could he suggest that people voted for somebody else or didn't have you on there?
He's not going to block me. Listen, I'm back on the back benches. It's wild there. It's free. I'm in the open seas. It's taken quite a lot of getting used to.
You sound heady, heady with excitement of the opportunities, the possibilities.
I think this is the only way to do it.
Yeah.
It's like, as I say, get over your grief and just move on.
Yeah.
And, I'm not dead. I'm very much alive and, there's new stuff to do.
Are you going to be a professional pain in the arse?
I'm not a professional pain in the arse. I am Emily Thornberry and I will remain who I am.
I'd like to say I am a professional pain in the arse. Anyway, let's move on. We're going to talk about the King's speech. This was the grand event of the week, the state opening of Parliament, the King's speech. This is when the government lays out its legislative agenda, and it was a packed, jam-packaramaed one. There was about 40 new bills in it. Now, someone in government told me that on average since 2010, governments have normally tabled about 20 bills per King's or Queen's speech. But this one was a whopperoo. It had 40 proposals: planning reform, education, rail nationalisation, economic stability. There's a lot of pomp and ceremony in this. You get the King in his carriage. What's it like watching it? Because you go from the Commons and you kind of process through and then you stand at the back of the Lords and watch it. What's it like?
Well, again, it's very different being a backbencher than being a frontbencher. So for the last, since forever, when you have the King's speech, both frontbenchers stand up and you kind of pair up as you go out, right? And then you go and stand at the bar so you can see what's going on, right? And so that's what's been happening to me over the last few years. But now I'm a backbencher. So everybody goes out, right? And I didn't realise, I'd forgotten. You're right at the back of the gang. So there's no room in the Lords and you have to go into the sort of lobby area outside.
Oh, right.
They've got two televisions. You can't even see the televisions, because there's so many people. And it reminded me, and we're trying to listen, but there's kind of people talking and you can't hear what's going on. And so it was a little bit like, the Life of Brian, where you get the people going, what did you just say? Did you say blessed are the cheesemakers? And we were like standing at the back trying to understand what had been said in the King's speech. We couldn't hear it. So you have to go back to the other lobby where you then get the speech written out and that's how you know what's happened. But it was a very different experience.
Have you, just one other thing, because one thing journalistically I love watching is like the PM and the leader of the opposition pair up and then the deputy PM and the deputy PM of the opposition. Everyone pairs up and they process through. Now, watching Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson having to walk together used to be one of my fascinations. Boris Johnson would be trying to make small talk and he just wouldn't talk to him. And then, of course, Starmer and Sunak seem to be having some bromance. What did you think?
I think that Keir is just so happy and it's lovely to see him. And, why would he argue with anybody at the moment? Why should he?
He's like a man that got all the Christmas presents he ever wanted under the tree and he's just opening them.
Yeah.
And every day there's a new gift.
Yeah.
I've never seen a Prime Minister happier to do a press conference than Sir Keir Starmer. Been to 3 now and he just comes in beaming like, hello, the world's press, can't wait to see you. It's quite a nice experience. Normally they look very grumpy. Let's see.
Give him a couple of years.
I know. Wow, a couple of years, eh? A couple of years or a couple of months. Let's see. But Ruth, have you ever been in the Lords for the King's or Queen's speech in your garb?
No, I haven't, actually. You've got to go into a ballot because we let these people in from the Commons, so there's not as many seats as there usually is, because they're all standing at the back. But also, there's actually too many Lords for the number of seats that are in there. But in terms of the ceremony itself, so I've not been in the 3 years I've been in. I haven't entered the ballot. But there was also a scandal this year, so I swear to God, I'm on a Baroness's WhatsApp group.
What's his name?
I think it's just called like Conservative Baronesses. It's nothing exciting.
Get on
right?
admin there and rename that group, Ruth Davidson.
Yeah, I should do.
In fact, we ought to have suggestions.
But anyway, like the morning after the election, so like the worst election for the Conservatives since like 1922 or everything, there was an entire thread on it of, I can't seem to find robes and hire robes at Eden Ravenscroft. Is there a waiting list I can get on? Blah, 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 blah. And like this went on and on and on. And people like, oh, maybe all the hereditaries have kept their robes or not sold them on, and blah, blah, blah. And there were like kind of distressed penguins about the idea that they might get a seat in the ballot but not be able to attend because they couldn't get this. And I was a bit like, lads, there's quite a substantial thing just happened last night,
Do you think it was displacement activity? Like
possibly.
They were so disturbed about the election loss that they displaced this into robe anxiety?
Possibly. I've yet to ever have robe anxiety, but maybe it comes to us all.
What did you make of this King's speech? It was a packed agenda, right? And it was quite an interventionist government.
I like the fact that Keir was a big enough guy to want to keep stuff that was in train before the election was called. So things like that phasing out of smoking, which I think will be a really positive public health measure for the country. And that while Labour had been out of power for a while, so they've got their own agenda and they want to push lots of things through, that they made space and kept stuff that clearly had merit and was pretty bipartisan anyway. Really interested to see how the housing stuff works out and if it does, because while there's, I think, broad consensus across the country that we need to build more, that's all well and good until it clashes with people having areas around towns that they already live in built on. And I think the stuff that wasn't in there is interesting. So there's been a lot on the two-child cap. I think that leaving that out is a very strong message, not about necessarily tackling poverty or not, but I think it's a very strong message about how much influence Rachel Reeves has in Treasury.
The thing, though, about all of it was that Starmer basically, and this is the kind of tenor by which I think they want to govern, he'd laid it out all at the beginning of 2023 in the missions. What was interesting to me about this King's Speech is if he pulls off what they say they want to pull off, be it with, as you were saying, Ruth, with housing, that is to build millions of more homes and have a national planning framework and set mandatory targets for councils. They can decide where they build, but the government kind of set the tone. If he does that, if he renationalises the rail, if he genuinely delivers English devolution, so metro mayors really have more powers and really can set economic growth plans locally, or if all of it comes off, it's going to be a very radical government. But there's a lot of ifs in that.
What's really interesting is 39 bills in a maximum 5-year parliament is a lot to try and get through in parliamentary time. And I get that legislating isn't the be all and end all of politics and of delivery, but there is also a slight concern that, for all he's wanting to just stick to his sort of meat and potatoes, which is what he's been giving us all the way along here, he's promised us a pretty big side of beef and half a field worth of potatoes, and he needs to get all these bills through.
And Emily, a full roast, which bits did you think were the tastiest?
This is a big to-do list. We've had to make sure that we prioritise growth. That's what we just have to do, which means that, we're going to unlock the planning system. We're going to build. We're going to put money into the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure. There will be howls. And I think it's also about intergenerational injustice. It's all very well for us, but for people under 40, they don't have anywhere secure to live. They can't afford to buy somewhere. There isn't the social housing for them to be able to get, a tenancy agreement properly. So what do? The only answer is to build. And I always think, that if you leave it directly just to local authorities, then what happens in a planning meeting is that everybody will pitch up if they know that there's going to be a new housing estate built next to them and say we don't like it. And so they will be there to lobby. But the people whose houses it will be in the future won't be there because they don't realise that it's their homes that we're arguing about. So you always get no's and you never get yeses. I always tell people, when I was 22, when I had left university and I moved to the East End, I got a hard-to-let flat. I got a council flat. It had been empty for 8 years before I moved into it. It cost like £9 a week. People just can't believe. Imagine that advantage that I had. I'm so fed up with it, that it takes so long in our country to build any infrastructure. And, unless we do, we are going to remain in the doldrums. And until we do grow our economy, we won't have the money to be able to invest in public services. And we won't have the money to be able to pay benefits for all children. That's why we can't pay the extra money for, go further than a 2-child benefit system. And I really hate it. Listen, my parents were well-heeled, well-off people, they had done well, and then they split up when I was 7. And I had 2 younger brothers, and my mother was left destitute. My father disappeared. There wasn't any money. She went on benefits. We got chucked out. We moved onto a council estate. And the idea that somehow or other my little brother shouldn't have had money available to pay for him, it's just awful that the Conservatives introduced that. But they have, and they've also left us, quite frankly, with an economy where, the tax burden is as high as it's ever been. Public services are on their knees, and we're in the worst debt that we've ever been. So we are inheriting a mess, and it's going to take us a while to get out of it.
But the two-child benefit, I mean, it was interesting because in the run-up to the King's speech, this is the policy, I'm sure all of you will have heard about it, where benefits are capped. So only two children, regardless of how big your family is, only two children receive benefits. And this is considered by all children's charities and poverty charities as a very cruel policy. It's deeply unpopular. Gordon Brown's asked for it to be scrapped. Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leaders, asked for it to be scrapped. And Emily, loads of your backbenchers.
You won't meet a Labour person who's in favour of it. We all hate it. It's got to change, but we've got to have the money, which means that we have to grow the economy. That's why we have to start with that.
When I was on television doing the King's speech live, John McDonnell messaged me about the Prime Minister announcing within his King's speech response in the House of Commons, he announced the Child Poverty Task Force and that he was introducing it in that King's speech. John McDonnell's view was that he was doing this because he understood that there is a lot of pressure from the backbenchers to remove the two-child benefit, right?
I just think that's unnecessarily cynical, quite frankly. It's one of the main things the Labour Party is about, is making sure that we look after people, that we have a strong economy. And if we're going to look after people, we have to have money to put into the National Health Service, into education and looking after the poorest and not increasing child poverty. Of course, we want to do something about child poverty. We're Labour. Of course we want to do something about it, but we cannot do something about it from not just a standing start, but being so far behind.
As a backbencher, you wouldn't support an amendment calling for it to be scrapped, which is what some of your colleagues are going to. You wouldn't do that at this point. You give Starmer some time.
You can't just expect everything to be perfect in the third week of a Labour government, much as we'd love it to be. And yes, of course it should be a priority. And of course we will all be making sure that it remains a priority, that when there is funding available, that we do spend money in ensuring that we, do everything that we can to continue to fight child poverty. Now, there are a number of things that can be done. And that's why Keir has set up, this group that will be looking at what ways are available. How do we coordinate? How do we get, as much as we can out in policy terms in order to make sure that we fight child poverty? Because it comes from our heart. That's who we are.
I mean, I'll wrap it up now and we'll go on to Blenheim and what Starmer's been doing there. But just my thought on the day as well was I looked back at what Blair had done in 97 in his then Queen's speech, and some of the big policies of New Labour that I would say have been sort of seared into our national consciousness were announced in that speech. So the national minimum wage, reducing class sizes to under 30, and of course devolution to Scotland and Wales. And I think in Starmer's speech, there aren't these kind of as tangible symbols of Starmerism, if you like, such as the national minimum wage. But if he pulls some of this off, it will be a massive legacy. I mean, that is the question, though, that this is going to be a very hard agenda to deliver. But if he does deliver English devolution, if he does deliver the house, and if he does change workers' rights in a way that people have more job security, you can see some of the contours of what might be policies that stick and kind of define his premiership. But let's see, it is early days, and my goodness, he's got a long way to go. Right, on Thursday, I spent the day at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. Now, this is the birthplace of Sir Winston Churchill, and it is a fancy pants pad, I'm telling you now. The Prime Minister was there hosting 45 European leaders at a summit for the European political community, and he stood on the steps and he personally greeted every single one. Now, I was told by his team that he'd requested to do this. One of them said to me that this is how he does it because he thinks it's the proper way to do it and that this is how you build relationships. Now, the funny thing about the timing of the election means the event was actually organised by Rishi Sunak. It was passed on to Keir Starmer. So again, on lucky general terms, he got the spoils of quite a lot of hard yards that Rishi Sunak had put in, but all of the European leaders turned up. And as I said, this is very unusual that in the first couple of weeks of being a prime minister, you get to meet all of the European leaders and you get a bilateral with President Biden, because obviously he went to the States for NATO. So this has been very, very fortuitous for him. There is a vibe around Starmer and his team at the moment. He really is pushing at an open door, because as someone who is an official sort of said to me whilst we were on the fringes of this conference, they said the benefit that Starmer has that Sunak suffered with, and which was amplified under Truss and Johnson, is that Starmer's not looking over his shoulder and everything he announces, or every bit of the relationship with Europe, to see whether the Telegraph readers agree or disagree, to see if his party's going to have a split or a fight about it, because of the splits that were riven within the Conservative Party, not just for the past 8 years around Brexit, but for decades over Europe. Starmer just doesn't have this, right?
You think about Liz Truss and when she was going for the leadership, and she was asked about the French president, is he friend or foe? And she said, oh, well, we don't know. I mean, it's just so shocking, and you're right. I mean, it's because she was playing to the Conservative faithful and she needed to have their backing. And there isn't the sort of internationalism that we still have in the Labour Party, is right.
And you wonder if, watching what happened yesterday, Rishi Sunak was thinking and had some regrets about not just to hell with the Telegraph, and to hell with the right wing of the party, and to hell with reform and all the rest of it. Because given what happened, it did him no good whatsoever to be constantly triangulating. If he just had the power of his convictions and argued for what he was wanting, and argued using conservative principles about the fact that, closer trading opportunities is a conservative principle, like all that sort of stuff, you can frame a lot of internationalism in the way in which your party is grown out of. And Labour does it in terms of the sort of international solidarity and all the rest of it. But I could give you things that are completely within a conservative mindset for why broad coalitions can be and fit in with your ideology if you're from the centre right. I just wonder if Rishi Sunak feels now that he could have been a bit bolder and a bit braver and a bit truer to what he believes.
But Ruth, kind of what I was saying, the Conservative Party as it is now isn't able to be internationalist. I mean, if the Conservative Party had a bit more of your ideology and your approach to things, then that does come from an internationalist background. But, remember, Rishi Sunak, one of the first defining things about him was that he was a Brexiteer. So it's all very well you saying, oh, we could do it, we could be internationalist by way of trade, but actually you go and leave the biggest one and you don't get you get very little instead.
So pragmatism on things like international security and, arrest warrants across boundaries and all that sort of thing. I mean, that completely comes under a conservative crime and security ideology.
But there wasn't the agreement.
Exactly, and he never front-footed it.
Yeah, because we left the European Union. We were saying, what are we going to do about all these security arrangements? We're just going to leave them behind. And there were these glaring holes with our agreement with the European Union. We have to now patch those.
The one thing I would say about Sunak, and actually Johnson before him in a different way, was although these Brexit bruises have run through the relationship, and when I spoke to an official about does it help that Starmer was a Remainer, he sort of said, look, we're not going to go over the past, sort of what happened 7 years ago, but they do like the fact that this guy respects the institutions of the European Union and wants to kind of have a closer, more collaborative relationship. But just on Sunak, he does have to take and get some credit, I would say, for the Windsor Agreement, the framework, which was to try and repair some of the tensions on post-Brexit trading arrangements. He did that. And then for Johnson, he did lead on Ukraine, didn't he, within Europe? So it is a bit more of a patchy picture. And I think Starmer is much more straightforward in the sense he's kind of going back to the status quo of how things used to be. Is that fair, Emily, do you think?
Well, no, because we're not going to be back in the European Union, but we're going to have kind of grown-up relationship with Europe and we're going to try and be close because they are our neighbours. What's the point in falling out with them? What's the point in point scoring by trying to be just juvenile about our attitude to Europe? I mean, I think you're right that it is difficult for the Conservative Party if you are concerned about how the Mail or the Telegraph or whatever are going to respond, and that perhaps now that we are in government and we have a large majority, we can just do what we think is the right thing to do.
And Ruth, on migration, so Starmer has scrapped Rwanda. You've always hated that policy. This was an area where you and Jess strongly agreed on throughout this pod, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You really didn't like that policy. Now, what Starmer announced today, and it was very Cameron, actually. I think you would have had your little Cameron spidey
I
senses.
did, because I've made
Yeah.
the exact arguments before, and we made that right at the beginning of the coalition years, which is about making sure that you use your aid and development budget very close to where people are displaced people. But in terms of the coalition policy, way back in those sort of 2010, 2015 years, it was always about when people are forced to flee an area of conflict like Syria or Afghanistan or places like that, it was about helping them settle closest to where they're from so that they can then return when things become more safe. So it's about spending the aid and development money before people have to travel across continents and then get to France and then take a small boat and all that sort of stuff. It's about spending the money upstream. And I used to have to defend this from Labour and SNP that we're all talking about. That means that we're not taking our fair share and all the rest of it. But there is an ideological reason as to why you want to be able to repatriate people as soon as it becomes safe for them to go back to their homeland, because they don't want to be stateless people. So yeah, there was I thought a heavy streak of Cameron in what Starmer was saying. I also thought his speech about the European Convention, he needs to work on his delivery style, because he could have made that sing. That could have been a real moment, I think, not just for people that support Labour, but it could have talked to the whole country a little bit about, how Europe wasn't something done to us in the United Kingdom. Europe was something that we helped build and that the United Kingdom has ownership of. And that includes Europe as the continent, modern as it is now, not just the European Union. And the Convention of Human Rights is part of that. And he could have, if he'd just given it a bit of welly, I really think there was a moment there that was almost lost.
Emily, do you ever see passion in Keir Starmer? Have you seen him passionate? Or is he just very loyally? Is that a word?
I think the time that I did was when he was announcing, these missions. The point is that not only do we have a King's Speech and what it is that we want to do in the short term, but it's kind of part of a 10-year plan on lots of different things. And so I was there for the launch of the crime mission. And the speech that he gave then was absolutely from the heart. I've known Keir since 1987, because we were both young lawyers together, so I've known him for years and years and years, so I know what his roots are. And to hear him talk with such passion about protecting people, protecting communities, was absolutely from the heart. And I said to him afterwards, that was brilliant. I've honestly never seen you speak as well as that. And the only shame was that so few people will have seen it.
I would say, because obviously I spend a lot of time watching what he does, he's definitely getting more confident, but yeah, sometimes the words are more powerful than the oratory. I guess that's something that might improve. The other thing, though, that was interesting, Emily, in the press conference afterwards, was the Prime Minister was asked about this returns deal between Italy and Albania. Now, under this scheme, so Rwanda is scrapped, but under this scheme, Italy have agreed that they will send in migrants for processing in Albania. So they send them to a third country. And then if your claim is successful, you can go back to Italy. Now, under Rwanda, you were processed in Rwanda. And if your claim was successful, you would not have been allowed to return to the UK. And the Prime Minister was asked about this. And he said, I'm a pragmatist. And he didn't completely rule out this sort of deal. And he said, I'm interested in basically talking about things that work. So there is some suggestions, or within the media, the wheel kind of our ears pricked up, whether or not, he might agree to process people in third countries, even though he scrapped Rwanda. Emily, what would you make of that as a policy?
You have to understand what Rwanda was. So Rwanda was just exporting people, just saying, well, we don't want you here. Your feet can't touch the ground. We're sending you off to Africa. It wasn't safe. The systems that they had weren't sufficiently robust. They would send people back to countries where they had been persecuted on the face of it. So that's different to ensuring that decisions are made by us about what we will do with people who arrive in our country. So then it's a question of where that happens. Does that happen in the UK, or does that happen, somewhere else? Do you see the difference? I mean, there are no plans that I'm aware of. I think that at the moment, the plans are to use the money from Rwanda to have a much beefed up returns group. So that I think is another 1,000 officials are going to be making decisions as soon as people arrive. Right, where have you come from? Let's have a look at your background. Let's see whether or not your claim for asylum is a legitimate one. And to make sure that we have as many agreements as we can with different countries.
Yeah, so I disagree with that, and I disagree with that on a point of principle, in that I don't think that as one of the G7 rich nations in the world, we should be exporting some of the stuff that we find difficult to other poorer countries and paying them to look after it for us. I think that's actually quite a post-colonial attitude to have, and I understand why it's being used as a deterrent, but I fundamentally disagree with it, and I think that it's the wrong thing to do. I think that, it is up to you to make sure that you have a robust asylum processing system, an immigration processing system, and that if people are landing on your shores, then you say, right, we'll go through it. What is it? Why do you think that you should stay here? Yes, you fit the criteria, you can come in. No, you can't. You have to, we will take you back to the country from which you are from. But I think doing that sort of work elsewhere, I think that is rich countries paying to offshore what they see as problems.
I mean, I hear you. I understand what you're saying. But I mean, we're a long way from that. I mean, there's still, what we're trying to do at the moment is clear the hotels, is make some decisions, is get the system going. I mean, it is completely just seized up.
But it doesn't get better by sending people to Albania to do it there. I'm sorry, it just doesn't.
Yeah, I hear you. I understand that. But what I'm saying is that the first priority is to get the system going as best we can right now. This is a record-breaking year for the number of small boats arriving in the UK.
The question I asked Starmer at the press conference was, there have been over 550 arrivals on small boats, people come in on small boats. Since he became Prime Minister 2 weeks ago, 14,000 people have come by these routes since the beginning of the year. This is a massive crisis for him. And he has scrapped the Rwanda scheme. Now, both of you strongly disagree with it. Lots of people do. But I'm just throwing in the idea that if he cannot and struggles to drive down the numbers of people arriving on these boats, the Conservative Party, once it gets its act together and has a new leader, they will make a lot of political attacks, I would imagine, on saying you are not reducing the numbers and you have scrapped what we would have said would have been a deterrent, and you are failing on this policy. Like Sunak, Starmer has a really difficult nut to crack that relies on lots of different partners playing their roles. And my prediction is it could become a massive problem of his premiership.
The biggest thing is that we need to treat these gangs like the criminal gangs that they are, as if it was terrorism, as if it was a threat to security. We need to put in the very best people, and we need to work across Europe, because this is international crime, to make sure that we crush these gangs.
The other thing is President Zelensky was there. President Zelensky and UK Prime Ministers, they seem to kind of really rub along well, don't they? In the case of Keir Starmer and President Zelensky, I mean, what was interesting about Zelensky was he came on the stage and took a not-so-subtle dig at Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. He's a big kind of sympathiser to Putin. He'd been on what he described as a peace mission to Moscow, and is calling for Ukraine to enter peace talks, something that Zelensky simply is not prepared to do if it involves any sort of suggestion that Russia gets to keep any territory that it has tried to take from Ukraine. And Zelensky really had a dig at Orban, who was there at the conference, and sort of said Europe has to be united. But look, the big elephant in the room to all of this European political community conference is, of course, the arrival of Vance as the vice presidential candidate in a Trump potential administration, who is very hostile to the US funding the Ukraine war. There is a growing sense in Europe that should Trump win the White House, and he's looking pretty nailed on at the moment. So there is concern, I think, over the idea of how does a Trump presidency change the outlook for Europe and Ukraine, and whether or not, should Trump win, will he just bounce Ukraine into peace talks? Because without US military might, can Europe fund and sustain Ukraine in that conflict? Ruth, how big a bloody problem is it?
I think that there would be nobody across Ukraine that's paid any attention to American politics that would have rejoiced at seeing JD Vance as the vice presidential nominee on the ticket with Trump. I think it's not just his kind of mindset, but he's spoken out in the Senate about why are we sending this sort of money abroad, and it seems to be as much as we know about him, it seems to be a real kind of article of faith with him about that spend money at home, don't spend money abroad, that kind of isolationism. And that will be worrying. I think Europe has to be as strong as it can be and encourage America along the way. And this will be a really big testing point.
Well, look, let's move on. Emily, I know you wanted to talk about MP safety after that assassination attempt on President Trump in the US at the weekend. There's been a lot of talk about this in Westminster as well. Starmer mentioned it in his speech in the opening of Parliament on Wednesday. The Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle said in an interview that this is what keeps him awake at night. And we've heard a number of MPs, including our own Jess Phillips, talking about how bad the election was in particular. Emily, you've been at this job for what?
Nearly 20 years.
20 years. Mm-hmm. Is it getting worse, the harassment?
This last election was the worst I've ever experienced. It was terrible. And coming into Parliament and talking to people, it's quite clear that my experience was not unique. And I think it's particularly bad, the attempted intimidation of women, and also particularly intimidation of women from ethnic minorities. I think there's something about camera phones and about taking film and getting off on trying to get a rise out of politicians and then putting it on social media and getting lots of clicks, which has resulted in a form of behaviour which can be intimidating. And we need to be conscious of that, because I think also if we continue to have this sort of aggressive hunting down almost of female candidates and treating them the way that they have been, those people filming may not actually physically attack people, but it leads to an atmosphere which is dangerous. I think the worst one I had was 8 people jumped out at me with masks on and cameras. And it's hard. It's very hard to deal with that when you're just knocking on doors and minding your own business.
My jaw dropped then. 8 people jumped out in masks.
The guy who came up to speak to me didn't have a mask on, so I spoke to him. I put my hand out to shake his hand, and he wouldn't give me his name, and he didn't want to shake my hand, so I thought, and then I realised, I looked round, and there were all of these people with masks on. Yeah. And they were filming
on your
me.
own?
No, I was with 3 or 4 other people. And eventually we got a car and I was able to get into it. But it was, it's deliberate intimidation. It's trying to film you being frightened.
Did you feel frightened?
I didn't show any fear at all. And I said to them, what part of two-state solution, immediate recognition of Palestine and immediate ceasefire do you not like? That's what our policy is.
This was around...
It was around Gaza, but I mean, to be honest, I've also had all kinds of other things. I mean, like we've had climate change people, lots and lots of different people. And then on Saturday, I was at a community festival thing, and someone started shouting at me saying that I hated the England flag. And I thought, oh my God, not that too. And then once he started shouting at me, then other people started having a go at me about Gaza. And it's just like one thing after another. And all I'm saying is that I don't normally talk about this, but I do think that my experience is not unique. And I think that particularly for newly elected women MPs, unless something is done, they are likely to suffer this sort of thing. And they do need to know that they're not alone. Because the point is that this is a tiny, tiny minority.
What would you like to happen?
Well, I don't know. I know that there's an inquiry going on, which is being led by the Home Office, and they will be sitting us down and sharing our experiences. I mean, I had about 15 different instances. And so, I will talk about that to them. And I think that, as I say, there's something about the films. And if you see that kind of film up on social media, you should call it out. You should call it out and you should say it's disgusting putting that sort of stuff up. And that actually, do you know what? Politicians are people. We are people. I know we're a bit weird, but we are people. And it's not right. It's also misogynistic to focus on women politicians out in the streets and try and frighten them. It's not on trying to intimidate our staff. I had 1,800 people outside my office shouting at me. I mean, really.
I've had occupation of my constituency office where I had a lone, single female in her 40s working there as my office manager who had the door kicked in, and then people that are filming inside my office around her. She's pressed the panic button for the police. She was there by herself. That's horrible. If you believe in liberal democracy, democracy doesn't work unless you have participation, and that means, people that believe in something, even if it's something you don't believe in, going round and making sure that they're talking to other folk. And then you get a position where you're shouting at politicians because you feel that they're not listening to you or that they're remote from you or what you care about. They're only going to get more remote if you act in this way. This is an absolute cycle that makes politics worse.
And you are not saving the planet by frightening people and then filming it and then putting it online. That does not help the planet. You are not a hero. You are just a bully.
Well, look, I think this is something we'll come back to. We have had loads of questions from you guys this week, and lots of people saying goodbye to Jess as well, who's very busy on her brief. I saw she's doing loads of speeches. She's all over the place. But remember, you can email me at any time on electoraldysfunction@sky.uk or send us a voice note to the burner phone 07934 200 444. And Sean has done just that. He's got a question about political friendships. He says, we see a lot of politicians arguing on TV, but are they secretly all mates behind the camera? Emily, are you all mates?
No.
Have you got... No. Sean, it's a no. It's a big fat no. Who are your mates?
They're Labour people.
Are they? Do you not have any Tory friends?
I have one or two. But not really. They're largely
really.
Labour, I'm afraid, yeah.
Okay, so you're quite tribal.
I am quite tribal.
Tribal.
I am quite
Ruth?
tribal.
Yeah, I think I had a slightly different journey from Emily. So because I had that weird thing where I got elected and 6 months later I was leading my party, it was really useful for me to have friends outside of my own party that I could blow off steam with because of the nature of the relationship that I had with my other MSP group and with our MPs and things like that. So yeah, I do have friends from other parties, and I've found being able to have that space outside of my own party pretty invaluable, to be honest. But, if Jen and I ever finally get around to getting married after being engaged for however many years, the people that will be like on the tables that come in from work there'll be more Tories than anybody else. You and Angela will come, Beth, if we get married.
I'd love to come.
Yeah.
I've just been dying for the invite. I'll be there. Right, well, look, that is all we've got time for. A reminder that we always want to hear from you. Email us, electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Send us your messages and voice notes on WhatsApp, 07934 200 444. Do keep them coming in, because during the parliamentary recess, when MPs are on holiday, and so am I for a bit, we are still going to be podding. We're going to have some special answer the questions episodes. So send in your questions. And I have one thing to plug. I know how much you love getting behind the scenes content. Well, there is plenty more in an election documentary. It's tonight at 9 p.m. and basically you get to sort of watch me running around the country and colleagues, and you get to go behind the cameras and sort of see what it's really like to cover an election, warts and all. It's quite a fun watch, so do watch. It's called Election Behind the Scenes at Sky News. So that is it. Emily, it was an absolute pleasure. I hope you enjoyed being on our pod.
Thank you
for coming in. All right, everyone, we will be back next week. Bye.
Bye.